Well, hello and welcome to episode 5 of this series of the Tyndale House podcast. This is a series looking at names in the Bible and in the ancient world, and today I'm joined by Dr. Caleb Howard, who heads up our Old Testament Names Project, and James Bejon, who's a PhD candidate here in the University of Cambridge, and who is also involved in our Old Testament research team. Morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good to have you with us. Today we are going to look at Genesis chapter 14, which is a fascinating story of Abraham rescuing Lot, his nephew. Abraham was called by God to leave his home. At the end of chapter 11, God makes promises to him at the beginning of chapter 12. He and Lot are separated. Caleb, just give us a bit more of the context. Fill in where this incident that we're talking about here, where that fits into the narrative of this section of Genesis.
Yeah, right. So in chapter 13, Abram and his family have just come back from Egypt, and they're in Canaan, and the land isn't big enough to hold all of their flocks of Lot and Abram, so they separate. And Lot goes off toward the plain around the Jordan River, the southern Jordan River Valley. It's well-watered. It's a beautiful place. And Abram stays in the hill country, in central Canaan. And the Lord promises to give him the land and so on. The Amorites are referred to in chapter 13. The sin of the Amorites is not yet complete, which matters for what happens in chapter 14. Chapter 14 shifts a little bit in kind of its scope from kind of focusing on Abram and his family to focusing on something sort of bigger, the political scene in Canaan at the time. And 4 kings come down from the north. We'll talk about where those are from in a moment. And they attack. They do a kind of campaign along the Transjordan region in Ammon and Moab and Edom, or what will become Ammon and Moab and Edom, and then kind of circle around in the wilderness and go back north, and they attack then the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and their allies. Lot is taken away with them because he's then living in Sodom, and Abram goes to rescue him. Now, all of this is connected with what follows in chapters 15 and following, because what we find Abram doing is developing more and more of a deep relationship with Yahweh, with whom he has a covenant in chapter 15 and chapter 17. And the Lord promises him a son. Ishmael is born, and so on. Whereas Lot continues to live in Sodom. And eventually, when we get to chapter 18, we find the Lord coming with 2 other men and visiting Abram as he will become. Abraham is a hospitable host, and he feeds the 3 men and so on. Isaac is foretold. And the Lord says that he's come down to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they are wicked. And so there's this theme of righteousness, Abraham's faithfulness and trust in the Lord, Sodom being wicked, and then the Lord does destroy Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. So Lot and Abram are to some degree foils for one another. Lot is not fully sort of Sodomite, but he is kind of living near Sodom, getting a bit comfortable with them. And the Lord does save him out of Sodom. But Abram clearly distinguishes himself as a person of faith who trusts the Lord and does not want anything to do with Sodom. And so the texts are linked in pretty significant ways.
Great. That's a very good overview. Thank you very much for that. Okay, let's dig into Genesis chapter 14. Do you want to read a chunk for us?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about what's going on in it.
Yes. So the text begins in verse 1 by setting the story that follows in a particular time. So it happened in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Aryach, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. So I take it that it's in the days of these people. Presumably some of them maybe were known to the author of the text and the readers. So this is from a later period. We don't exactly know when, but looking back on this time, and it's setting the story in a time that people would have known in relation to Amraphel and his confederates. And then verse 2, they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinav, king of Admah, Shemever, king of Zavoim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these allied together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and the 13th year they rebelled. So it's clear in that verse that Kedorlaomer is the leader of these northern kings. Even though he wasn't named first in verse 1, he'll be named first consistently when these kings are listed or talked about thereafter. And then verse 5, in the 14th year came Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. So there's Kedorlaomer again at the head of the group. And they struck Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Shaveh Kiriatayim, and the Horites in their hill country Seir, as far as El Paran, which is upon the wilderness, or before the wilderness. And then they returned, and they came to a Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they struck all the field, or the territory of the Amalekite, and also the Amorite, who was living in Chatzatzon Tamar. So this is the setting. These northern kings have now come down and sort of done a kind of hook. They've come down along the Transjordan region, across on the other side of the Jordan from the main part of Canaan, moving southward. They're attacking people along the way, and then they go almost as far south as the Gulf of Aqaba, and then come back up and meet Sodom in the Dead Sea region.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. For many people reading this, suddenly they're quite happy with the narrative so far in Genesis, and then suddenly there's this barrage of names and places that people don't recognize, and they often don't particularly have any context in which to put these people. So what can we say about them? What do we know about who these people are and where they're from?
I mean, maybe it's worth saying initially, not recognising the names and feeling in slightly unfamiliar territory is kind of part of the point, isn't it? I mean, most readers just of an English Bible will have a familiarity with Hebrew names. I mean, they might not know it, but names like Hananiah, Azariah, they'll kind of mentally recognise the ER ending to them, and they'll probably be familiar with elements like Melech in a name, Abimelech, Elimelech, and so on. And immediately, just looking through these, they'll get a sense of foreignness, won't they? At least in the context of the biblical narrative. These names will kind of strike them as a bit strange, and we know something about them, like Elam, we've had mentioned before, haven't we? He's the first son of Shem in sort of Genesis 10's table of nations, where the writer is sort of putting the pieces on the board, if you like. And so they're...
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, so Elam by this point is the territory that we would think of as Iran, pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's far afield, but their dominance over this region, over Canaan, is in a sense an unfolding of the promise or prophecy that Shem will have dominance over Canaan. So we've got, just from the narrative, without sort of Caleb's encyclopedic knowledge of the ancient Near East, we've got some clues that we can stitch together,
Right, yeah.
That's very helpful, because I suspect that readers, let's say in the time of Hezekiah, might have read these names and thought similarly to us. They might have thought, these are odd names. I don't recognize these among my friends or family, right? So they're not, these names are not all even Semitic. They correspond pretty well to sort of where these people are from.
Yeah. So we've talked about this in previous episodes, that names are characteristic of particular times and of places. So these names are characteristic of their time and their place.
That's right.
Not of Canaan, and perhaps not of later periods. Is it very time? Are they very time appropriate names as well as geographically appropriate?
Yeah. Right. So I just emphasize that there are even critical scholars who are doubtful of the historicity of the Old Testament will say that there are very old features. There's a collection of very old features in Genesis 14. Now, I just put an emphasis on collection. So it's not just one or two or three of these sorts of features, but lots of them, several of them coming together in one place. And we won't talk about all of them today, but one part of that set of features is the names. So these are, in fact, foreign names, and they're appropriate to where they're from. So a great example is Kedorlaomer, who is king of Elam. So Elam, as you said, is in kind of southeastern Iran. It was adjacent to Mesopotamia, adjacent to Babylonian, so it was a great state, a large state throughout the second millennium BC and the first millennium BC, and so it became a major enemy of the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
Right, it's to the east of Mesopotamia, which is where Assyria and Babylon are.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a long way from Canaan.
It is a long way from Canaan. And lo and behold, the only period that we know of when the Elamites might have been in this region is in the time that the Bible more or less puts Abraham. So we don't have the Elamites sort of being over in Canaan or Syria, Lebanon, in later periods, in the first millennium BC, for example, in the time of David and thereafter. We have him there kind of in the time of Abraham and his offspring. So quite early period. And his name, Kedorlaomer, is really clearly and thoroughly Elamite. So we know a bit about Elamite. We know a bit of Elamite language. We have some inscriptions from the Elamites, and so it's possible to reconstruct the language. So Kedor is the first part of that name, Kedorlaomer, and it corresponds to a word in Elamite, Kudur, which means shepherd, or maybe protector, probably shepherd. And then Laomer corresponds to the word Lagamar, which is actually a name of a deity that was worshipped in Elam. We know this because they've actually discovered the evidence of the worship of this deity in a place called Susa, which was one of the capitals of Elam, the one nearest to Mesopotamia, to Babylonia. And actually, as it happens, Lagamar, the deity that they were worshipping there, probably comes from Mesopotamia, at least linguistically it does. Lagamar, the name of that deity, means no mercy in Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, not an Elamite. And what's interesting is that when the Elamites brought over that name into their own language, they probably would have softened that G a little bit, and they would have made the final consonant of the Akkadian form of the name, which would have been an L, into an R. So the softening of the G would have come across in Hebrew as like an ayin, which is what we have, la gamar, la amar,
right,
la omer. That O part has the ayin in it, which would have corresponded to Akkadian G, and Elamite it would have been softened. And then the R on the end of Kedorlaomer's name would originally have been an L in Akkadian, but in Elamite it would have been brought in as an R. So all of it really reflects not just kind of, well, not Semitic at all. It reflects Elamite. Yeah. And this is a king of Elam. So that's a good example of the sort of thing that's going on. This is clearly a foreign name, and presumably would have been recognized as such by them as much as by us.
Yeah. So we've got the individual elements, haven't we? We haven't got the exact name attested, but we've got the building blocks.
Right, okay.
Imagine you were familiar with names like Richardson and Davidson and so forth, and you also know someone called Robert. You could recognise Robertson as a sort of classic English name. You know, you've got the building blocks, and you can...
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's great. So what about Amraphel and Arioch? So Shinar is the area that we think of as Babylon, Mesopotamia. Elasar, is that Assyria?
Well, no.
Or is that...
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No. Well, it's hard to know what it is because we don't know. But there are a number of possibilities. It's been suggested that it's a city called Larsa in Babylonia.
Okay.
I don't think that's right. It's probably not right. It doesn't account, for example, for the fact that it begins with a vowel this way. So Larsa, and then Elasar. How does that work exactly? Doesn't fit very well. It's also been suggested that it's Ilan Tsura, which is a place in kind of northern Iraq, southern Turkey. But again, Ilan Tsura has that sa sound, and here we have Elasar, which is a different sa sound. So it's like, does that fit? It doesn't really fit very well. So it's difficult to know exactly where this is. What we do have, though, is Arioch. So we don't exactly know where this person is coming from, but we have Arioch. So in text from a city called Mari, from Syria, from the 18th century BC, the 1700s BC, we have a name repeated as living in kind of northern Mesopotamia, northern Iraq, southern Turkey in this period. And the spelling of the name is very similar to the spelling of Arioch's name in the Bible. I mean, it's basically identical for all intents and purposes. It may be Hurrian, which is a language kind of spoken in that region in that period. Hurrian, was spoken less in Canaan.
Right.
And certainly not in the first millennium. We don't have Hurrian being spoken in the first millennium in Canaan. Was a bit in the second millennium. But it does fit its kind of context.
Yeah.
Yep.
But this is a name that we also see much later on in Daniel, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
So is this a name that lasts, or is it an almost identical name that appears later on from a different source?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I don't either. I don't know how to answer that.
It could be either.
Okay.
Names can kick around for quite a long time, particularly in dynasties, can't they? I'm not sure that suits Daniel 1 particularly well. So it may just be something that looks similar, and there are plenty of those.
Yeah, sure.
Another possibility is that Hurrian was spoken in that northern Mesopotamia, northern Iraq region into the first millennium. So potentially there were people with Hurrian names all the way down to the Neo-Babylonian period in the 6th century, which is when we have Ariach in Daniel.
Okay.
So it's possible that, that is a Hurrian name that continues there in that region. My point is just that we don't have Hurrian in Canaan during the first millennium. We have it in the second millennium, that kind of earlier period.
Right.
Yeah. So Amraphel is a classic problem in terms of analyzing it. We don't quite know what it is. So if you have in your mind kind of the Amorite language,
as we all do,
as one does, and like Amorite names that were being used in the time of Abraham, it kind of reminds you of that. So for example, fits pretty well with Amu, which is pretty common in Amorite names. The L on the end, the sound L, the syllable L on the end, kind of feels like it's similar to the word for God. But it's hard to sort of parse that out and see how it would have actually worked out in a real name. So there are a couple of possibilities, but we really don't know the answer at the moment. Okay. I would say it's most likely Semitic, maybe Amorite, but it's hard to know exactly what name it would be.
And if it is Amorite, does that fit with this guy coming from Shinar?
Yeah, Shinar. Well, depends on where you think Shinar is. But I personally think that Shinar is most likely Babylonia, right? So in other places in the Bible, it's clearly Babylonia.
Yes, yeah.
So I tend to think that most likely these names are being used in pretty stable ways. But I should say that some scholars, very good scholars, think that Shinar, in this case, in this chapter, refers to a place in kind of Syria along the Orontes River that we know from some letters, the Amarna letters from the 14th century BC. It's referred to as Shangar, which would fit pretty well in terms of the consonants here. That's possible. So in that case, we would need to say that Shinar sometimes in the Bible is Babylonia, and in one or two cases, it's referring to this place in the Levant.
Okay. So it's clearly Babylonia in Genesis 9, the plain Shinar.
Yeah.
Here it's less certain, but you would lean towards it being Babylonia anyway?
I personally lean toward that.
I would. I mean, I think that's what the reader's going to have in mind when they get to here, and I think Scripture is written like that,
Genesis 9 is not so far back, is it really? It's just 5 chapters, in fact.
I should say, in terms of the historical context, it works either way, let's say. So in kind of this 18th century period, if that's when this is set, and the old features that I've mentioned are mostly from those sources. If that's the case, then it works equally well if this person is coming from Babylonia. The name works, the setting works, the political setting works, and so on. Or if they're coming also from the Levant, from Katna region, which is where Shangar would have been. It works either way.
Okay, great. And what about Tyndale, king of Goyim?
Yeah, so Goyim is just nations in the Bible. Difficult to know if that's like you can have kind of native names for places and foreign names for places, like names that are used in foreign places for foreign places, or names that are used locally, right? And so it's possible that Goyim was like, I don't know, a name that you used in the Levant and in Canaan and places like that for wherever this is, maybe let's say Turkey or something like that. But it's difficult then in that case to connect it with a concrete place from original sources, right? They wouldn't necessarily call it Goyim if they're in, the sources are from Anatolia or in Turkey or somewhere like that. So it's difficult to get anywhere with the word Goyim apart from its nations. Tyndale is a pretty much ideal correspondent in terms of the linguistic structure of the name to the name Tudhalia, which has until fairly recently been best known from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC and the late 2nd millennium BC from the Hittite setting from Turkey.
Okay.
But it's become more and more clear that they're good examples of this for at least one military leader in that same region in Turkey from the 19th century BC,
right?
20th and 19th century BC. So that there's a set of texts in the old Assyrian dialect of Akkadian that has lots of references to a Tudhalia from this period. Yes. Now, we can't say that that's the same person. We don't have enough evidence to establish that. But what we can say is that the name was current then. It was available during that time. So the upshot then is that all of these names are at least explainable, and some of them are most likely from this kind of early 2nd millennium BC setting.
That's really helpful. But we don't have archaeological evidence of these people, and we can't necessarily locate the places, but everything about them is authentic to the right time.
That's right.
Yeah. And as I've heard you say many times that we can't expect to have archaeological evidence for everything because what we have is just such a tiny fraction of all of the stuff that there would have been. And what we have by accident, which
that's
is
right.
such a helpful point.
Yeah, it's worth just bearing in mind that Genesis 14 presumably is written from the point of view of, let's say, people living in Canaan, whether Israelite, well, I think certainly Israelites at least later. I don't know about the sources of Genesis 14, whatever they were. We don't know what they are. So it's written from the point of view of foreigners looking at 4 distant kingdoms, right? Elam, Goyim, Shinar, and so on. So I think it's just worth just thinking about that, right? They would have viewed them and referred to them with their own terms, their own names, and so on, that may or may not have lined up with the native names,
right?
The native forms.
Yep.
And that's not wrong. Everyone does that.
Sure.
And given the fact that this story is told from a later point of view, again, I'm not trying to date Genesis, I'm just saying it. Genesis 14:1 seems to indicate that it is a later time looking back. The names might have moved on as well in their pronunciation or whatever. So later readers might have thought of these people with slightly different names or pronunciations of those names and so on. And that's perfectly fine. We all do that when we tell history.
Yeah, great.
It may be worth just thinking briefly about the fact that these 4 names being foreign and being appropriate in their time are interconnected also with a set of other features of this story and the stories around it that are quite old. And I just emphasize that that's the case. And examples would be the reference to the Amorites, Mamre and his brothers with whom Abram is in a covenant. That's really interesting, by the way, because the Amorites are the enemies of Joshua and the others in a later period. Yeah. But it's in this period that the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. So then Abram, he's in a covenant with these people, and it's the Sodomites who are the objects of God's wrath. So that's a different setting, a different historical setting and so on, and difficult to imagine how they would have thought that up. Imagine that if this were invented.
Okay, yeah.
Then there are a lot of kind of features of the text that fit pretty well with the text from Mari that I mentioned earlier, where we find the reference to Ariach and so on. Examples of that would include Abram is called an Ivri, which is a word used for tribal people who were living out on the countryside with the animals in that period.
So that's verse 13.
Yeah.
Abraham the Ivri.
Abraham the Ivri. Now that's connected, of course, with the ethnic sense of that term. So I'm not saying they're not in opposition to that. This interpretation is not in opposition to that ethnic use, but it does fit pretty well in that setting. The separation of Lot and Abraham to the right, or Abram to the right and to the left in chapter 13 fits pretty well. It's a common way to talk about separating between tribes, particularly when there are disputes around grazing rights. In that case, north and south is probably what's being referred to with left and right. Right? You face east, left is north, right is south. So they seem to be going, splitting along those lines. And then later on, the name Benjamin is a name that fits very well in that period. We have people called Benjamin in that period. And we also have a tribe or a tribal element, a tribal confederacy in that period. So there are a number of things that come together, and it's really important to see how it's the collection of things that are old that's significant, not just the one or two things.
Yeah, that's really helpful. What can we say about the more local kings, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah, Zeboim, and so on? James, anything to say on those?
You feel the shift. So a reader who's fairly familiar with some Semitic languages will instantly pick out the odd root that they recognise, like Av to do with father, or Admah to do probably with redness or something like that. And so you immediately, as you move on from verse 1 into verse 2, feel that you're more at home with these kind of names. I would guess that Birsha is some sort of contraction, some shortened form of son of Resha, someone born in an evil time or something like that.
I see. Right.
We have a few other contractions like that. We have a Bishlam in Ezra somewhere, which is probably shortened Ben Shalom, Ben Shalem, something like that, a son of peace, perhaps someone born in a peaceful time. And these kind of names are still very common in Africa or in Arab countries these days. Someone who's born in a drought is sometimes named like son of a drought and so on, And Admah, I guess, as I say, is to do with perhaps the redness of the environment. Think of Edom, that's got the same root. And then sort of he is partnered, the Melech Admah is partnered with this Melech Tzfoim, which I take it to be some sort of variant of an Israel named Tzfoim that's got an ayin in it, which probably means checkered or something like, mottled. And you get a few names like that in this region, in and around the Jordan. Balak, probably his name. Well, in fact, the modern day name for that whole region is Balga, or Balgar, which is from the same root as Balak, which is sort of mottled. Rechem is again from the same region, it's got the same sense, checkered, So they're familiar sort of Semitic names, I think, in verse 2.
Might be worth saying as well that they fit a pattern of names that we have outside of the Bible. And by a pattern, I mean often names are composed of two words, and it'll be a noun followed by a noun, or a verb followed by a noun, and those form patterns. They're names that are that have the same pattern, even though they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So, for example, a name composed of Ben, son of something else, is a pattern. It's a fairly common pattern. I have names like that at Gored and Al-Laq and places like that. So not only is it there are modern parallels to that semantically, but also the pattern of the name is similar. And then the reference to Shem Ever, so Shem being name, that's a fairly common word to occur first in a noun pattern name. Name of something, so like name of a deity or something like that. And name there probably means something like offspring of someone who carries on the name of the thing that follows. So Ever, then a few ways you might interpret that, but it might be an epithet of a deity or something like that. So name of something, name of maybe the strong one or something like that. That second element is really debatable, but the first element fits a pattern. It fits with kind of what we find in other names in this period.
Gomorrah could be to do with the root for abundance, kind of same as Omri and the word for sheaf in Hebrew. And so that would kind of fit. It's a plentiful region, and so a name like Gomorrah would fit it if it's to do with plenty. And, yeah.
Do we know what Sodom means?
I don't.
There are a few options, but it's hard to know.
It's worth just saying, though, that the study of personal names and the study of place names can be a little different. So place names on the whole, all things being equal, will tend to be more conservative and stick to their places, whereas personal names shift over time.
Right.
So if you get new population groups into a new place, for example, one of the things they may do is ask, what's that river called, or what's that city called, or what's that mountain called, or whatever. And they may use the old name. They may not. They may give it new names. That also happens. But the preservation of old names is a thing we see. Whereas population shifts tend to bring in their personal names with them, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's just worth bearing in mind that a name like this might not even be Semitic. It might be from another language that isn't attested. It was just there already. We have a number of names like that in Mesopotamia, where the names are just unanalyzable by us, and it may just be a completely unknown language.
What about verses 5, 6, and 7? So we've got these people, the Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Umim, the Horites. What can we say about them? And then the Amalekites and the Amorites, who are a bit more familiar to us.
Yeah, so I don't know if you necessarily agree with this, but I mean, it seems to me that you've got these 3 names for giant-like clans in and around Canaan. So Anakim, largely in Israel. The Emim is the Moabites' term for a similar group of people, just as tall. And the Zamzumim, this is now in Deuteronomy 2, is the Ammonites' name for, again, an Anakite-like group of people. And Rephaim seems to be the kind of cover term for all of them. And so in Deuteronomy, it will say things like, all of these are classed as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them this. And so it seems quite likely, given that these kings of the north are sort of going down the Transjordan at this point, that the shift from Rephaim, in terms of the people who they defeat, then some Zuzim, which is pretty similar to Zamzumim, and then these Emim, seems like you're going from sort of somewhere northern and a generic name to Ammon and then to Moab afterwards. And so you may even get captured here a little bit of sort of local detail, and whereas you might use the cover term Rephaim, it may be that this is sort of reflecting some more detailed local terms for what's...
Right.
And it progresses in verse 6 to Seir, which is in the south, and so on. So I think that's a great analysis. I mean, I think that's how geographers sort of portray it in their maps and so on, right? So,
yeah. I mean, we know, don't we, that as kings did campaigns, they tried to record the names of the places that they were, and took scribes with them, and presumably, like you say, asked locals, what's this feature, etc.
Right. You said giant-like people, so these are we come across these characters in a few places like Goliath, don't we? That it's these very tall people. Yeah. Do we have evidence for such people? Modern people can react quite strongly against the idea of Goliath being as tall as the text says he is.
It depends on what you think evidence is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about it. I think we've got remains of kind of unusually large skeletons and sort of 6-fingered folk, and you do get quite a few names actually that translate as 6-fingered. It seems to have been a fairly popular name in various places. So,
okay, great.
Can I say one more thing about the place names?
Yes, do.
So it's worth just noting that sometimes these place names are clarified. Right. So verse 2, the last king in the list is called the king of Bela, so we don't get his name, apparently. The Hebrew says, he Zoar, that is Zoar. And it seems that is Zoar is a way of telling us again what Zoar is, or sort of, telling us again what Bela is, giving us another name for it. Sometimes scholars call it glossing. So there's a term that needs some kind of clarification, and so another term that explains it somehow is added. And I think it's fair to say that most scholars interpret that sort of phenomenon in the Old Testament as some kind of an updating of the name. So the first name, in this case Bela, would have been an old name, that people would no longer recognize, and so Zoar is given to it.
Okay. And that happens again in verse 8, doesn't it?
Yep, it continually happens. So verse 3 also, right? Yeah. To the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. And so on. So, yeah, you're right. It keeps happening. Verse 7, Ein Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and so on. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. And I think one way of viewing that, I think it's really helpful to us, bearing in mind that the chapter is told from a later point of view. So the way the chapter is framed at the moment is not so much from the point of view of kind of Abraham in his time, so much as someone later. Again, I'm not trying to date it, but looking back on that time. It leaves open the question of when that later is. But just bearing that in mind, those kinds of glosses then become examples of how the text is kind of user-friendly in a way. So whoever is managing the text is recognizing that these old names are no longer recognizable to people, and they're updating them with new ones, indicating that they're trying to maintain continuity of readership and of understanding of the text over time.
Which is very natural, isn't it? It's not wrong. I mean, you did it in your introduction. We were talking about Elam, and you said this is modern day Iran.
Exactly.
You do that so people understand.
Make the connection. And actually, you can also find similar impulses in texts from the time between the Testaments. So some of the texts from Qumran, where we get a lot of biblical manuscripts, but there are a lot of extra biblical manuscripts too, or non-biblical manuscripts. And one of them, called the Genesis Apocryphon, retells this story from a kind of outsider, from a different point of view. And it glosses some of these names again, gives them another name. So it's just worth bearing in mind that that's a kind of scribal impulse, something that scribes tended to do to sort of make things understandable.
That's really helpful. Yeah. We're out of time, really. Any final thoughts on this, or anything you want to quickly pick up in the rest of the chapter that's just worth drawing our attention to?
Maybe one thing worth saying, the detail you mentioned a while ago, Caleb, the king of, where is he, Bela, in verse 2, doesn't have a name before him. And this kind of thing has a feel of authenticity to it. If you're reading, I don't know, about a battle in a J.R. Tolkien book or something, you're not going to have the odd king's names missing kind of thing. He's making up the names, and so he makes sure he makes up the right number. And then sort of later on, where are we, verse 8, they all appear, in fact, without their names. And you wonder if there's a kind of theological point to that. We've got in Shinar, haven't we, the desire, let us make a name for ourselves. And you wonder if these kings who always have...
Genesis 9, yeah.
Right, the 11 or
the 11, sorry. Tower of Babel, isn't it?
Yeah, and you wonder if something, I mean, Abraham has said, or God has said to Abraham, I will make your name great. And you wonder if who is named and who is not named here has got a kind of theological agenda of who's exerting, who's got power over the region.
I mean, one other observation to make before we end is that there are some connections between the meanings of some of these names and what's going on in the context. I'd emphasize it that this doesn't need to mean the names are made up. Correlations happen in history this way too. So Birsha and Bera both have these, right, son of evil and son of guilt. There's another interpretation that reads them as in evil and in guilt. Maybe a bit less convincing, but either way you read it, that fits very well with the narrative arc about the evil of the Sodomites and the portrayal of them, part of their kind of narrative portrayal. And in the course of the story, it's striking that then later on, Abram aligns himself with Melchizedek, who is king of righteousness. And he wants nothing to do with Sodom toward the end of the chapter, which I think is pretty significant. Again, Melchizedek is a perfectly appropriate name for the time. So we don't need to think about that as being made up somehow. But there is still a correlation going on between the name and its use and the kind of narrative themes going on. And the narrative clearly over Genesis 13 and following wants to show us this interplay between Abram's faith like Genesis 15:6. Abram believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, but also the fact that Abram's faith produces response. He obeys, he does things. So he circumcises the males in his family in response to the Lord, and the Lord calls him to walk before him and be blameless. And in Genesis 26, isn't it? The Lord says to Isaac that Abraham kept all of his laws and statutes and so on. So there is an emphasis overall in the narrative, and it's remarkable to see how tightly woven the narrative is, even down to its names.
Amazing. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caleb and James. This has been a really fascinating discussion again. We've got one more episode in this series, then there'll be another series on names coming later in the year or early in 2025. But thank you for joining us, and join us again next time.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.